I asked students as we were driving to this farm to think about all the nature writing that we'd read about. And now we're about to immerse ourselves in an experience that's based in nature. Find an artifact on that farm, video, photo, tagging it using the text from the works that we've read, which was a great way for them to have this reflection moment at the farm, think about class, think about it on an intellectual level, and then how that intellectual experience then becomes an active experience. And yeah, I think it kind of breaks down those walls of getting them in ways of like seeing how they can connect the two.
Aloha and welcome to the Unrulr Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Shorn, Head of Growth and Community at Unrulr. And I'm joined by one of my favorite human beings in the history of the earth, Kelly Fast, who was the Director of Experiential Learning at a really cool school in Kansas City called Notre Dame De Sion, and who will flower into the Director of Academics and Experiential Programming at Cascades Academy. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the podcast.
No, thank you. I'm honored to be here and talk to you. What an introduction.
I could go on for hours. Kelly, I'm going to start with a question we ask all of our guests. What's your philosophy of education?
Wow, that's a great question and a big question. And I suppose it's evolved over time. I am going on 30 years as an educator and began the journey as a English teacher, was an English teacher for 20 years. And in fact, mostly a AP and IB English teacher. And only in the last 10 years have I transitioned more into the experiential world. And I would say big moments for me in the last 10 or 15 years have been my own experiential travel opportunities and the impact they had on my career. And then wanting to bring that same type of education to students. So I saw the real value in getting students outside of the classroom, global education, really connecting maybe earlier on, like in-class content to, out of class experience. For me, most specifically that began with literature and Dante's Divine Comedy. Then I created a course where students, read and discussed that text in class, but then we traveled to Italy as a part of that course and experienced some of the stuff that we read about firsthand. And I think that's kind of the first iteration of, what became important to me as an educator. And then over the last 5 years, really developing those programs to where totally flipping the model to where the, beyond the classroom walls, education became the more important part of the journey, and was actually supported by the kind of inside the classroom rather than the other way around. So for me, it's developing authentic, student-driven experiences that really ask students to be curious and sincere about their learning, give them agency, connect to real-world professionals, to really see some value, like real value in what they're learning.
I love that. I mean, I think so many times we as educators have to go through the experience and have to model that learning on our own as we bring it to our learners. I think one of the things that's been amazing in watching you teach and how you collaborate with students is how their identities and their backgrounds play a role in the programs you create. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Being in Kansas City, which is a really interesting place. There's a lot of, educational development here. There's the Kauffman Foundation, there's the CAPS program. So there's a lot of exciting stuff going on here, but I would, at least in my specific journey, it had been more traditional education, not a lot of experiential education. And in the traditional classroom, where the teacher is sort of a sage on the stage, it's all about content. And all students are sort of equal learners, or I don't know if I would say nameless or anonymous, or, it's more about the content than it is about the learner. So in this model that I'm a proponent of, and the programming that I've tried to create, I'm really trying to enhance, a student's, identity, a student's preferences, a student's passions, which honestly, a lot of my students haven't really thought about before. They've been so attuned to only doing what they were asked to do in class, or
It's like a new skill that they're developing.
for sure. They often use this language of they're really great students, but that they're sort of trying to figure out what the teacher wants, right? So they're trying to write the right kind of essay or deliver the right
100%.
kind of product to get the grade in the class. And that might not even be true. I think most of my colleagues don't have a certain thing they want, but that's the student's perception in that kind of environment. So in this sort of model, where I ask students to pick their own research, their own projects, pursue their own passions, like it really does begin with like really teaching them, like, how do you even explore that? Like, how do they even figure out what it is they like, because they haven't been asked to do that before. So that's the first part of our journey. But for me, as we pursue it, and I end up in a class with 9 different students with 9 totally separate projects that are based on their interest, it's just a much more exciting environment when they're bringing their own identity, their own desires, their own passions, their own strengths, to those projects.
I love that. I mean, I think you and I presented in DC together, and it was amazing to see how moved people were by the work that you did and are doing at Notre Dame De Sion, right? The ability for you to take the portrait of a graduate, like these key competencies of you in the school, and have them kind of be lived, and have them be at the core of your assessment. There's so many schools, public, private, charter, that are in this journey, whether they're kind of rebuilding an ex-ed program or creating competency-based learning, or whether, like the state of Utah, they've like dove in headfirst into PCBL, personalized competency-based learning. I'd love for you to give the listeners like kind of the tips and tricks, or like the core principles you found or pathways into creating a really powerful competency-based learning program.
Sure. So not to make it too long, but for me, I sort of fell into it out of necessity. This role that I'm in at Sion, and God bless them, they're very forward thinking in terms of wanting to develop the most experiential learning model in Kansas City, but it was new, so my role was new. So I had entered a school that is 120 years old, has been and continues to have traditional elements to it. It has a traditional grading scale. It has AP courses that are very important to the school. And so my role and the emphasis on experiential education was new for many stakeholders, students, parents, teachers, board members. And so kind of dove head first with programming, which I had a feeling of the value of, and I understood the value of. And I thought everyone sort of equally understood that same value, but, lesson learned, there needed to be more communication to everyone about, how experiential ed is rigorous, how it is, a beneficial or sometimes even more beneficial way of educating than what we've been doing. And so for me, in order to make that happen, I sort of came back to square one, and I fell back to our portrait of a graduate. I inherited this at Sion. They'd done a lot of work of developing 9 skills that they wanted every student to leave Sion with. And they're really wonderful, durable skills. Things like being an empathetic perspective taker, a humble difference maker. I love these. Every school I've been at has a portrait of a graduate, but these qualities really spoke to me. Being a growth-minded learner, being a mindful communicator. And so I sort of took that at face value of, well, this is what we are promising to our students and parents, that if you come to this high school for 4 years, that you'll leave growing in these skills. You leave here 4 years better than when you arrived here. And I sort of looked at it pragmatically, like, are we really doing those things? How do we know we're really doing those things? And the first thing I did was sort of audit our traditional courses. our kind of in the classroom math, English, language courses, et cetera, to sort of see, self-assess from teachers, like where are these things being met? And not in any way to make teachers defensive. They're doing a wonderful job teaching other things in their classroom as well. And in some ways it wasn't or isn't a fair ask to ask them to teach calculus and ask the student or find out a way to make the student grow as an empathetic perspective taker in a math class. So we kind of set that groundwork of finding out where the gaps were, basically, that really a student could leave Sion in 4 years and maybe missed some of these things along the way. So then I came back in with experiential ed as a way for us to fill in those gaps. So this allowed me to show the specific value of our program as tied to our portrait of a graduate. So it allowed me to speak specifically to our stakeholders that you did great work in choosing these skills. So now let's make sure that we're developing programming that's helping to develop those skills. And so when we do deep dive immersives or create curricular experiential work, I make sure that we start not with the content or not with the destination, but with the outcome. And so are you developing a course that is allowing students to, I'll just keep going back to the same one, develop as an empathetic perspective taker? Okay, now let's build a destination around that, or now let's build a content curriculum around that. But the core is like, let's make sure we're assessing this skill and the student's development of this skill.
And what does that look like as you're building it out? Like, how are you getting people onboarded? How are you getting people excited? How are you growing this program that you're building?
I think speaking to that language got people excited in the first place because it sort of tore down this dichotomy of traditional education is rigorous and experiential education is fun. That's kind of what I was dealing with here.
You were trying to show the rigor in experiential education.
Yeah, I'm always trying to show the value, and the value is in some ways rigor. So it is like redefining what is rigor. Like, how do we know that the traditional education is rigorous, or what do we mean by rigorous? And for me, it's just going back to those terms or going back to those outcomes or going back to that portrait. Like, we've defined them. So let's just make sure that we are like following those outcomes or living up to those outcomes. And I think that gets people excited because now they're actually doing the thing that they claim that they're doing, or they're being given a method or an outlet to maybe achieve those goals in a better way or an easier way or a more efficient way than they could in their classroom. So I think showing that value helped with excitement. It helps parents be excited about the education for their students. It helps students who really are already excited about experiential ed. For them, I found they kind of naturally want to do this sort of education more, but they are still a product of this system. So they worry that they're not doing the right thing if they're taking a kind of non-traditional course. And then teachers who some have been at Sion for many years previous to this experiential ed movement. It helps them to see the value and to sort of transition and kind of build the great skills that they already have, sort of like continue to build those skills in a way that's directed toward a specific outcome. Now there are other challenges for it. I mean, there are all sorts of tools like rubrics. How do you assess empathetic perspective taking? How do you know a student has gone from this level of empathy to this level of empathy? How do you grade that, right? How do you give her a 97% on empathy? So we've done some things to try to standardize and assess those skills so that we can have documented proof or artifacts that demonstrate that growth.
I mean, at every conference I go to, with you or without you, at NSP, ICEN, GEBG, like the question always comes up around assessment and documentation. Mm-hmm. And for me, in my work, like as a K-12 capstone coordinator, designing similar programs to yours for 5th graders, 8th graders, 12th graders, and so on, it was about this culture of documentation and this culture of storytelling that would allow for learners to be able to have greater agency over how not only they told the story of their learning, but like what they accomplished and what they did, and really got at like process and reflection versus just the product and outcome.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how you think about documentation, both at Notre Dame De Sion, but like you're going to a new school, a new institution, new people that you're going to have to get in your corner, new students that you're going to have to connect with. Like, what does documentation look like in this world of competencies and in this world of experiential education?
Yeah, that's great. I like these terms, culture of documentation, and I like focusing on the process, and definitely like in empowering students to have agency in creating that. I think are key. So, wow, right? I mean, in a traditional classroom, it's easy to document the learning with a grade. Like, but who really knows how, I don't want to say legitimate, but you could have grade inflation. One teacher's grade could be different than another teacher's grade. Of course, we try to standardize it. What does that grade mean? So when you're shifting instead to, a course that I've created, which is this Global Impacts Micro School, which is a school within our school that's very experiential based. I definitely wanted to, while I still ultimately had to put a grade in the grade book, it was kind of an afterthought. And the main thing I wanted to do was to document this journey for students, right? So this course asked them at its core to use the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a kind of standard in a comparative global studies course, thinking about Kansas City. And actually then our sort of like comparison point was Kenya. And ultimately these students were developing their own like environmental or sustainable research projects, working with partners in Kansas City, and then ultimately working with partners in Kenya and traveling to Kenya to enact this research. And now they've come back to Kansas City and they're going to, share that learning. So all of that, long story short, really like needs a culture of documentation for many reasons. I mean, we need to show, a student's journey in this course. So at Scion, we still do transcript this course as an English course, a science course, an ethics course. And there are some kind of traditional, written assignments or discussion assignments that would happen in other courses that we can say, well, that's an English grade, or this is an ethics grade. But mostly we're trying to show this experiential journey and have artifacts and tangible evidence to show that a student has grown along the way, so that ultimately we've developed a portfolio at the end. The student can speak to her development and communicate that growth to a college, which is where most of our students are heading. So for me, it came back to those outcomes and asking students to think very specifically, and we kind of like empowered them with rubrics about their growth as an empathetic perspective taker or as a mindful communicator in all of our experiences. And we had some place for them to do like narrative reflection where they could use that as an artifact. In this experience today, I connected with this community partner in conducting this empathy interview where I listened to how they're approaching the subject. Here's where I sort of started with empathy. Here's where I'm continuing to think about empathy. Here's where I've demonstrated, an empathetic perspective. Or I've been reaching out to community partners. That's really asked me to be a much more mindful communicator, in my email correspondence or my phone correspondence or my face-to-face correspondence. So they're kind of writing that and they're self-reflecting on all of that. Now, something we've done with you all at Unrulr that's been really helpful is kind of taking that all to the next level of how do we have visual artifacts, and not just from bringing our great marketing photographer in and having her take photos along the way, or as teachers taking photos along the way, but how are we empowering students to be able to like photograph and document with photo and video their own journey. And Unrulr has been great for that because then we can connect through this tool a specific outcome. So a student now thinks about being an empathetic perspective taker. We're in Kenya or we're out in Kansas City. She sort of sees evidence of that. She can either take a photo of that, connect it to that outcome, and then narrate a little below it, with some text explaining how this photo is representative of being an empathetic perspective taker. It's much more powerful. It's powerful when it's outward facing and we're communicating that to other people to see that image. But also, I think the most important part for me was this idea of process that you talked about, that now they're a part of the process. They're actually thinking in a much more metacognitive way about what does it mean to be an empathetic perspective taker. And ultimately, like the goal would not even be for me to assign, hey, go out and find an example of you being an empathetic perspective taker today, but they're just recognizing that it's happening and then they're documenting it for themselves.
That's huge. That's
like too long of an answer, but
no. I mean, that's that what you said at the end, like that shift from passive to active.
yeah,
Not having to assign a bunch of inauthentic assignments, but
yeah,
allowing them to demonstrate learning so that you don't have to mess up the vibe, but also take away from that awesome time of. And I think like this collaboration has been amazing, watching your learners, have these video reflections, these exit tickets of an experience, watching them out on a farm with a community stakeholder, capturing images and then connecting it to Thoreau and Yeats and Mary Oliver, right? Like literally seeing them connect all of these different worlds.
Yeah, that's been great because that then allows me also, as the experiential learning director, to, I think the best experiential learning is stuff that's embedded back into the curriculum.
Totally.
So I run a series of what we call deep dives at Sion. I think a lot of schools, or some schools, have these immersive experiential week or weeks, and we have those here. Those are great, and they have their own value. They still, though, seem to students, teachers, parents, then it kind of can be counterproductive sometimes of emphasizing, oh, well, here's this other type of learning. It's not the real type of learning or the traditional type of learning. It's the break from learning. So ultimately, we want to get that just back into the classroom. So that is the learning. We definitely think about it as the learning. So a great example that you brought up, like a way to sort of demonstrate this to students, is this class, this micro school, as experiential as it is, it still has an AP Lit element. So we do read a ton of texts in class, or I ask them to read texts at home. And we do read a fair amount of poetry. And so for that week, before we went out to visit this urban farm, students did read, like you said, typical AP texts like Thoreau, like Emerson. We did some romantic poetry. They also read some Mary Oliver. And then when we went out and did our visit on Friday of that week, I asked students, as we were driving to this farm, to think about all the nature writing that we'd read about, because most of that stuff was nature writing. And now we're about to immerse ourselves in an experience that's based in nature in many ways. And so to find an artifact on that farm, video, photo, and then connect it back to what we did in the classroom. So they were tagging it, not with their own thoughts, but using the text from the works that we've read, which was a great way for them to have this reflection moment at the farm, think about class, think about it on an intellectual level, and then how that intellectual experience then becomes an active experience. And the active experience also gets intellectualized. It's not just a fun experience now. I'm kind of seeing those connections. And yeah, I think it kind of breaks down those walls of getting them in ways of like seeing how they can connect the two.
There was this amazing post where one of your teachers documented them working on a project. They were creating period poverty kits for women in downtown Kansas City that don't have access to menstruation products. And the teacher was the documentarian in Unrulr, taking all these amazing photos and writing this piece. And then either you or her ran the single coolest inquiry protocol I've ever seen, where each learner commented on the post. And then it was like a daisy chain, commented on the comment of the learner beforehand, and displayed this incredible metacognition and critical thinking. Can you talk about that? Like how you designed that, like how you built that culture in?
Well, yeah, thank you for the compliment about it. We did put thought into like for us, Unrulr is this great tool, and then you can use your creativity as a teacher for all the ways you want to think about using and engaging students with it. And so for that assignment, yes, we had students as one of their projects in the micro school, because each unit is project based, and we were in this UN Sustainable Development goal of good health and well-being. Students partnered with a community partner that was dealing with the issue of period poverty. Students ultimately then developed their own project here on campus for another experiential conference that we have, where they ran sessions for their fellow students. So they became the teachers. So that was
That's
great.
so cool. That's so cool.
Yeah, I mean, it was great in and of itself to give them that agency and to take a passion of theirs and try to share it with their other students, and to see all the really pros and cons of it. I mean, the pros being that they were able to like own the learning, be in charge of it, connect to their peers, and the cons being the challenges that sometimes you're passionate about something and your peers aren't. And they got to see that firsthand of like, hold it, they're not like, it's not landing exactly the way I was hoping it would land. Those are all great conversations. So my colleague photographed the event, and then she created the Unrulr post of those photographs. So about 7 images of students doing all this great active experiential learning. She then asked students in the class to look at those as an artifact and comment on like connecting those to like, this is an example of me being a mindful communicator or a growth-minded learner. Like explain how these photos are showing that for me. So the first student has a great paragraph where she's commenting on that. And then what that allowed was then a series of comments and a great feedback loop from them when they were able to not only comment as to how they felt, but comment on each other's comments. And yes, we get this 10, 12, 15 comment thread. That the interesting thing that happened, I don't know that we thought about this ahead of time, was those photos were an artifact, but really those comments became the real artifact for them. So when they are looking at their own growth, the growth is happening in real time as they're actually thinking about growth-minded learning in a conversation with each other. And then it's all documented there too. The conversation is captured to share with other stakeholders later, which is kind of hard to do in a discussion class when all that kind of floats away sometimes.
I love that. And it also, I mean, you provided the great Angela Stockman, who's at Damon University in New York, talks about the power of pause in learning,
Yeah.
like, and retrospectives and reviews. And it doesn't matter if it's XEd or an AP class, just like really allowing your learners to just stop for a second and think about what they've accomplished.
I think by nature, experiential ed can be so exciting and so much content. And we often then forget to give students that space at the end of it.
100%.
And so it really wasn't experiential learning. It was an experience, but they didn't even have time to think about or process what they did. And for me, a lot of trial and error, because I often get excited about these and kind of overpack the experience. And then the students are really just frankly, physically and emotionally, worn out, right? They're not even really thinking too much about what they're doing. But to carve out time at the end of the experience, I often say before the students even get back on the bus, because once they do get back on the bus, then they're talking to each other, or then they're thinking about school, and then we arrive back at school, and then a certain percentage of it's lost. They still remember parts of it, but carving out time for them with Unrulr, with a journal, some way for them to like sit and process and think about what they've done is important.
I love that. We're working with Blue Dot Education. Shout out to Blue Dot. Some of the coolest educators are based out of San Diego I've ever come across, and they work with schools. And I was talking to Brian Delgado and a bunch of other rock stars there, and they talked about the bus ride back as a force for reflection, and the day after as a way to capture all of the amazing moments. And I think like that's what's exciting about my work at Unrulr is like we now have a tool that allows you, like the pensive from Harry Potter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like to take your memories and have this vessel, right? Yeah. Where that can be an artifact of learning, right? If we're in Ron Berger's language, an artifact of excellence, right? Yeah. He talks about that in an ethic of excellence. And like, to me, that's the learning. Mm-hmm. Like that's the most important metric of success, that they can display metacognition or critical thinking, that they can talk about their evolution or growth, that they can show you pieces. It's 1,000 times more important than an A that you're giving them.
Well, absolutely. I mean, in year 2 of our immersive experiences at Scion, our push was for continued development of reflection and professional development for our teachers who aren't really trained in reflection, to again move these really amazing travel experiences or place-based experiences,
Right.
um, beyond content into a place where students are actually reflecting and then transference occurs. Because if not, it's all lost at the end of the week. We go off into spring break and then they come back, and it's not really connected to anything else. So I can't, I can't emphasize enough, to my faculty, the value of that and of slowing down the experience and really giving students time to think about, talk about. And you're right, with Unrulr, then it's just a much more efficient way to capture it, because the student has their device, and if they're being very like overt or thoughtful and connecting it to an outcome, then it's already like kind of serving the purpose of the school or portrait of a graduate. But it's then capturing that language and photographs that attach to that language. So it's an amazing tool for that, to like just house all of that stuff.
What, closing out the conversation, though I want to talk to you for 7 hours. I'm reminded by something the great Fu Tranchi, who's at Oakwood School, said to me. And he said, why do we call it experiential education? We should just call it education. This is what education is, right? He said, by calling it XEd, we make it an other. We make it something else. Something that appears on the front page of our school's websites, Markham departments tout, but isn't truly integrated into the rest of the school, right? It's like the school within a school that we see so much in public, private, and charter that drives me crazy. How have you, this is advice for people building these programs or trying to rekindle them. How do you build traction? How do you get more learners in your program? How do you ultimately make this the school?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's been my journey for the last 2 years. So my title is Director of Experiential Learning. So we do fall into that model that Fu's talking about. And I think it's a double-edged sword. In some ways, you're trying to promote that your school is doing this thing that other schools aren't doing. So you do need to signpost it in some ways. But you're right, the more you do that, then you're emphasizing this is different from the regular learning. And that the regular learning now in some ways is somehow maybe privileged to the better type of learning. And then you do have to always guard against, I've talked to Fu about this as well, the idea that experiential ed is just fun versus joyful. Fun is a more shallow form of learning. Or you have to guard against a lot of Instagram posts from your marketing department of students playing with puppies, right? Because it's kind of sending the wrong message for what experiential learning is. So how do you, there's so many things you're asking there. Number one, like the ultimate goal would be, this is what learning is. Like experiential ed is what the school is. I would say number one, the best way to do it is to make your programs like the least ancillary, so that they are not discrete or separate from the rest of your school year. There's a real value in immersive experiential weeks because it frees up the school schedule to travel or to be off campus. So there is a value in them, but the best, I think, version of it is a curricular experiential course. The Global Impacts Micro School, yes, is a school within a school. So I get, baby steps here at Sion. I get that it's not the entire school. We have other curricular programs as well. I think those show that this is part of the curriculum. This is part of the education. So it kind of signposts in a better way that this is what learning is. Some other things I've done over 2 years are to then flip the dynamic. So in the early part of my career, I was an English teacher interested in experiential ed. So I would find English elements that we could get off campus, field trips. We could go see a play, right? So it's a form of experiential ed, but it's really serving English. So instead, let's flip it around and have the course really be an experiential course, and English is serving it in some ways. So then you push beyond that when you're hiring for that course, the next year, instead of hiring for an English teacher or hiring for a math teacher or a science teacher, you're really hiring for a global education teacher or an experiential education teacher, or a global micro school teacher who
100%.
has, yeah, who has, experience in English. So English is a skill that we want you to bring to this, but the bigger skill is we want you to think about education outside of the classroom, connecting with community partners, your ability to travel, your ability to develop a global ed program. Those are the primary skills. Teaching students English under that is an important skill too, but you're really thinking about it in a different way, and you're sort of looking for a different sort of educator to teach that course. So you're slowly then transforming your school with educators who are interested and excited about this sort of learning. I think just on a really tangible level, it's really working hand in hand with your college counseling department and making sure that they are really writing your school's profile in a way and communicating to colleges in a way that these courses are the most rigorous courses at our
Such a
school,
fantastic point. Such a
right? So
fantastic.
yeah, so if a student is in the global micro school, that is the most rigorous junior course. Or if a student is in another course of ours for seniors, designing real world impacts, that is the most rigorous. So now students aren't afraid to take that course because they think that a college is going to think, oh, the AP course is the more rigorous. Colleges are, in my experience, been very open to whatever you determine as a school to be your most rigorous. It's just communicating that information to them, so that you can make that change. And then also communicating that to parents as well, because they're worried about that same thing. Um, those are all sort of practical like skills. On the visionary sort of dreamy side of it, yeah, I mean, to have a school that's competency based rather than grade based, that's experiential based, that's not even dividing subjects up, that is just connecting students to real experiences, where they are learning these other skills, science skills, math skills, English skills, like in this experience. That to me is the dream, and that these are at a high level. These things are rigorous. Students can show all the growth you want in the portrait of a graduate, like develop the skills that are actually important to employers, important to colleges, much better in these sorts of systems.
I love that. And it's frustrating, right? I don't see the urgency, especially in places of privilege where the antiquated system still is their bread and butter.
Sure. Well,
Um,
yeah, I mean, institutions by nature don't want to change, I
yeah.
think. I mean, right? No harm, no foul. It's working for the institution. So why would it want to change? I visited a school last week, and met with a bunch of students, and talked to them about my work. And it was kind of crazy to me that they were interested, and they asked all sorts of great questions. And some were so excited, about what I could be in a class where I'm like traveling to Kenya. Like that's what I'm doing in class. And I'm actually developing a drip irrigation project. And you could just see how exciting. I would say all of them were excited about that prospect. But then there was one student in class, who was like, I don't know, like I prefer the system as it is. I prefer AP classes. I prefer grades. And I kind of like, I loved that. I like loved hearing from him, like why? And he really like frankly said, because I know how that works. And
I know how to play the game. I know
and
how to
I'm
play
good
the
at
game.
that. And he clearly said,
Right.
no offense, he clearly said it's a game and I know how to play this game. And I'm a junior now and I don't want to change the rules. Right. I mean, I would rather finish up because I'm successful at it this way. But to your point, of course, if the game is benefiting you or you're successful within the system, why would you want to change it? But there are plenty of educational reasons, humanist reasons to change it, and plenty of students and teachers and parents who want to change as well.
I think it's a great way to end the conversation, and there'll be many, many more. Excited to have you and Fu on together.
Oh, that'd be
Um,
great.
where can people find you, Kelly, to learn more about your work? To how do people connect?
Sure. So I'm in kind of a limbo state of moving from one school to another. So I don't have a new email at my new school yet, but I'll be at Cascades Academy starting in July. Director of Academic and Experiential Programming, kindergarten.
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. And I'm excited for that new journey and excited to, my previous experience has been with older students, 9 through 12. So to kind of think about experiential learning for kindergarten through eighth graders as well will be a great challenge and something I'm excited to develop. And they have so many great programs there already.
Yeah.
So it will be
They're amazing.
Working with a place that fully buys into experiential learning and sort of like helping to, think about curricular elements to it, think about the things that we're talking about in this conversation. So you can find me there at Cascades Academy, wherever that email might be. Really fast. I'm not sure how or what that looks like there. Yeah, I don't really know where before there. So, I mean, right now you could look at Notre Dame De Sion. The work that we have in experiential ed is the work that I've done there.
Yeah, I'm sure you're on LinkedIn as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Great. Well, Kelly, thank you so much. Beyond grateful for your time and for being, I don't know, a trailblazer in this space, or at least someone who's showing us what's possible. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.